Holy Gospel according to Mark chapter 10. Glory to you, O Lord. James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came forward to him and said to him, "Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you." And he said to them, "What is it you want me to do for you?" And they said to him, "Grant us to sit, one at your right hand and one at your left in your glory." But Jesus said to them, "You do not know what you are asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink, or be baptized with the baptism that I am baptized with?" They replied, "We are able." Then Jesus said to them, "The cup that I drink you will drink, and with the baptism with which I am baptized you will be baptized. But to sit at my right hand or at my left is not mine to grant, but it is for those for whom it has been prepared." When the 10 heard this, they began to be angry with James and John. So Jesus called them and said to them, "You know what among the Gentiles those whom they recognize as their rulers lord it over them, and their great ones are tyrants over them. But it is not so among you. But whoever wishes to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wishes to be first among you must be slave of all. For the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many." Gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, Christ. Please be seated. As some of you may know, and as some of you actually met him, I have a younger brother named Austin. He's 5 years younger than I am, so growing up, we had our differences. Mom and Dad always said that I was the more intuitive child. Well, one of those occasions when my intuition shined through and Austin's lack thereof took center stage was doing chores in January while growing up. We grew up raising cattle, and in the winter, because we live here in Colorado, especially when the temperatures reach the 30s and below, the chores can be extraneous. Namely, the chore of breaking ice in the stock tank so our livestock can continue to drink water throughout the day. Don't get me wrong, it's a satisfying job, chopping at the ice until beautiful triangles start bobbing in the icy water, making a frigid soup. And then comes the fun part of trying to balance the slippery triangles and huck it several feet from the tank as to not cause any unnecessary broken bones. Well, even with those satisfying chops with the axe or the shovel, it's not on my first choice of preferred chores. Apparently, though, it was Austin's. One morning, we're all huddled around the fire, summoning the courage to venture outside to do chores. And 7 or 8-year-old Austin piped up, "Well, I love chopping ice." As the intuitive big sister, I was giving Austin not so subtle hints to please kindly knock it off, because whatever Austin volunteered for, the sibling got voluntold to do with him. And if Austin loved chopping ice so much, well, lucky for us, we get to do it all winter. I felt a little like Jesus in that moment. You do not know what you are asking. I chuckle at the 2 siblings in our reading today because it begs a theme of asking for something you may not know the full gravity of. Like chopping ice every single morning, all winter long. And the gravity of what James and John is asking is far more than morning chores. It seems like Jesus is asking, are you ready for it? You begin in verse 35. James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came forward to him and said to him, "Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you." And he said to them, "What is it you want me to do for you?" And they said to him, "Grant us to sit, one at your right hand and one at your left in your glory." So Jesus and the disciples are heading up to Jerusalem, and this request of the 2 siblings come right after Jesus' third and final prediction of his trial, suffering, death, and resurrection. Right after the rich man asked how to get into heaven, and right before the healing of the blind Bartimaeus in Jericho. We are sandwiched between these great scenes of what it means to follow Jesus and what it means to be a disciple. And yet, James and John don't quite get it. Remember verse 37? Grant us to sit one at your right hand and one at your left in your glory. Or in other translations, in the places of honor next to you. Seems like they miss things Jesus has said and done since the beginning of the gospel, except for maybe the transfiguration, because they recognize that glorification does wait a Jesus. They may imagine a triumphant, regal scene with themselves sitting in the positions of honor and power at Jesus' right and left, and perhaps they were thinking of something along the lines of being with Jesus in glory, like Moses and Elijah were at the Transfiguration. Now, I will say it is easy to rush down this line of thinking, but I think it's important to remember that we, sitting here in the 21st century, have the gift of hindsight, that post-resurrection lens, so it's easier for us to say, come on, why don't you understand? Because it may have been hard to understand what a rising from the dead means in Jesus' third prediction. But Jesus said to them, you do not know what you are asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink, or be baptized with the baptism that I am baptized with? So James and John don't have a clue what they're asking for. And Jesus says as much, basically asking them, you don't have any idea. Are you ready for it? Can you drink from the same cup of suffering and death I must drink? A cup that I myself will later ask to be removed by God if possible? Well, they courageously reply, we are able. Then Jesus said to them, the cup that I drink, you will drink. And with the baptism with which I am baptized, you will be baptized. In these verses, the present tense of the Greek verbs are used, drink and baptized, which means that Jesus has already begun to experience the suffering of his passion. And it makes me wonder what that says about ministry. Do Christians suffer only right before death? Does being Christian automatically mean we get it easy? We all know the answer to those questions, and it's no. And in this request of James and John, Jesus first points the disciples to suffering before the glory. Oh yes, James and John, you will get the cup in the baptism, don't you worry. And later on we find out that in Acts 12:2, James was martyred by Herod Agrippa in 44 CE for being a leader in the Jerusalem church. In Galatians, we learn that John did survive his brother and served in the church of Ephesus, but that doesn't mean he didn't go through his life without the cup of suffering and the baptism Jesus talked about here, right? Friends, being Christian is not easy. In fact, being Christian hardly makes any sense at all. What sound person would voluntarily sign up for a faith that has us taking up our crosses and following a Lord who came to earth not to be served, but to serve, and then to get spit on, tortured, and crucified? Who would sign up for that faith? It makes no sense. Or does it? We continue on. But to sit at my right hand or at my left is not mine to grant, but it is for those for whom it has been prepared. When the 10 heard this, they began to be angry with James and John. Here, again, Jesus directs the disciples back to God, to the one who determines who shall be at the right and the left, the one who has prepared those places. And then the rest of the disciples fume over the brothers' bid to outrank and outflank them. I don't know about you, but gosh, that sounds like the disciples treated each other like siblings. I just remember Mom and Dad would be trying to teach Austin and I a great lesson, and here Austin and I are bickering about, well, she touched me, and he hit me, and stop chewing so loud, and you're so lame. And yet, even with the bickering and fuming like siblings we have in the gospel, Jesus doesn't give up on the lesson for each of the disciples and for each of us. So Jesus called them and said to them, you know that among the Gentiles, those whom they recognize as their rulers lord it over them, and their great ones are tyrants over them. But it is not so among you. But whoever wishes to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wishes to be first among you must be slave of all." Here, Jesus corrects the disciples by holding up the Roman authorities as an example of what not to be. The ones in power exercising authority as tyrants, an authority that stands in stark contrast to the enlightening and restorative authority displayed by Jesus. Why is this teaching this morning so difficult? It's because it requires surrendering ingrained ideas of honor and dishonor, power and weakness. And Jesus takes it to the next level when he uses these two Greek words, diakonos and doulos. Diakonos meaning servant. Now, being a servant would certainly challenge normal expectations, but even in these ancient times, there was an appreciation for rulers who provided public service. And then Jesus pushes the matter to the next level, to an extreme, when he goes on to say that to be first is to be a doulos, a slave for all. Slaves were at the bottom of the social ladder, and there was no honor or reward in working for others as a slave. And here's where it gets good. For the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many. The good news is this, friends. We learn in the Old Testament the usage of the Greek word for ransom, while sometimes referring to a redemption or purchased freedom, was just as frequently referred to as God's deliverance of people. Jesus' life as a ransom is a liberation shaped by divine strength. It's more than just a payment. It's about power and servitude, not just the problem of the sin and the need to secure forgiveness, while those are important pieces of it. It secures a release. So what does that mean for us? This means that we have to ask ourselves this question like Jesus asked James and John, paraphrased. Are we ready for it? Are we ready for our own cup of suffering, but equipped with the love of the Lord, a community that unites around the worship and service of God, and the perspective that there is more to come? We see that in the perfect example of God's only Son. Jesus embodies and lives that suffering in his passion. He affirms the promise of his glorification, and he forgoes the power to control his fate and prevail over others in his crucifixion and death. And what it makes it so radical is the identity of the one who does it, Jesus, who frees people from captivity to another power, restoring them to membership in the community that corresponds to God's love. Being a Christ follower and being a part of the community it creates is utterly different from what we experience around us. When Jesus gives his life as a ransom, he frees us not to become great as the world understands greatness, but to serve others as slaves of Christ. And that really is great for us. And so, are you ready for it? Please pray with me. Sovereign God, you turn your greatness into goodness for all the peoples on earth. Even in our suffering, you are with us. Shape us into willing servants of your kingdom and make us desire always and only your will. Through Jesus Christ, our Savior and Lord. Amen.